New York believed the courtroom was neutral ground, a place where reputations flattened, power paused, and everyone answered to the same rules. Inside those walls, the street was supposed to stop mattering. That belief lasted until one moment. In the middle of a public court proceeding, under oath and under lights, a man laughed. Not out of nervousness, not because of confusion. He laughed because he believed that Bumpy Johnson had no power there, no leverage, no response available to him in a room controlled by judges, records, and procedure. It was a small act and a dangerous one. The courtroom noticed it. The gallery noticed it. Harlem noticed it immediately. Because in a place where words are measured and gestures are remembered, laughter isn't casual, it's contempt made public, and public contempt changes the meaning of everything that follows. What made the moment unsettling wasn't the insult itself, it was what didn't happen afterward. Bumpy Johnson didn't react, he didn't correct it, he didn't acknowledge it at all. No glance, no expression, no shift in posture. To some, it looked like restraint. To others, it looked like weakness. But to people who had watched him long enough, it meant something else entirely. The response wasn't going to belong to the courtroom. That's when the city began to pay attention, because history had already taught New York a rule it preferred to forget. When Bumpy absorbed public disrespect without answering it immediately, the outcome was rarely personal and never small. Silence wasn't surrender. It was selection. By the end of the day, nothing had happened. No confrontation, no correction. And yet, something had shifted. This story isn't about a man laughing in court. It's about what that laughter triggered. And why, after 1955, New York stopped assuming that public rooms were safe from private consequences. Because sometimes, the loudest signal of power is choosing not to respond at all. The courtroom that day was ordinary in every visible way. Wooden benches, a judge elevated just enough to command order. Reporters scribbling without looking up. Procedure moved forward with the steady rhythm New York trusted to flatten reputations and strip moments of emotion. This was a place designed to neutralize power, and then the laughter cut through it. It wasn't loud, it wasn't disruptive enough to stop proceedings. That's what made it effective. The man laughed at the exact moment when authority was supposed to belong only to the court, a signal that he believed the street had no jurisdiction here. In that brief sound, he wasn't mocking a person. He was mocking a position, specifically the position of Bumpy Johnson. In Harlem, insults carried weight based on context. Private insults could be managed quietly. Public insults demanded precision. But courtroom contempt was different. It was recorded by memory even when it wasn't written into the transcript. It happened under rules that suggested immunity, a belief that procedure would protect the man who laughed from consequence. That belief was common and wrong. The danger of the laughter wasn't emotional. It was structural. It suggested that once inside the system, informal power ceased to exist, that the courtroom reset all hierarchies, that Bumpy Johnson, surrounded by law and documentation, was reduced to just another defendant. Harlem understood immediately what the city at large often missed. Power doesn't disappear in formal rooms. It changes posture. The people watching didn't react because reaction would have validated the insult as a disruption. Silence did the opposite. It froze the moment in place. Everyone present understood that the laughter had crossed a line, not because it was offensive, but because it was assumptive. It assumed safety. That assumption echoed beyond the courtroom walls. Word traveled quickly, not as gossip, but as assessment. A man had laughed publicly. The laughter wasn't challenged, and Bumpy Johnson had let it stand. Those three facts mattered far more than the laugh itself. Outside observers drew the wrong conclusion. They assumed restraint meant limitation, that the courtroom had accomplished what the street could not, that public order had finally imposed itself. Inside Harlem, the interpretation was different. The response had been delayed on purpose, because moments like this weren't corrected where they occurred. They were corrected where they mattered. The courtroom moment didn't weaken authority. It clarified the boundaries of where authority would respond. And by the time proceedings ended, one thing was already certain. The laugh would not be forgotten. It had been logged, not in documents, but in the kind of memory that doesn't require evidence to act. The city thought the moment had passed. Harlem knew it had just begun. After the courtroom emptied, New York did what it always did after a moment like that. It predicted noise. The logic felt simple. Public disrespect, delivered under lights, usually demanded a visible response. People expected something fast and unmistakable. A correction, a warning, a reminder that laughter had limits. The city had seen that pattern often enough to trust it, so it waited. Harlem felt the expectation immediately. Conversations didn't focus on what had happened in court. They focused on when the response would arrive. Not if, when. People adjusted their routines, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. When public lines are crossed, the window between cause and effect usually stays narrow. That window stayed open. Outside Harlem, the expectation hardened into assumption. Law enforcement prepared for escalation, quietly repositioning attention without drawing notice. Rival groups held back, believing any movement might collide with an incoming response. Even the press framed the moment as a provocation that would soon resolve itself. But resolution never came in the expected form. The silence stretched past the point where it could be mistaken for oversight. Hours became days. Days passed without incident. The absence of reaction didn't diffuse tension. It concentrated it. Every hour without a response forced people to reconsider their assumptions about how power behaved when it was publicly challenged. That reconsideration was unsettling. In New York, predictability was safety. When events followed familiar scripts, everyone knew how to position themselves. This didn't follow a script. The city had prepared for retaliation and received nothing. That mismatch made the moment harder to read than any overt response would have. People began to realize that the courtroom had not neutralized anything. Instead, it had created a false sense of closure. The laughter hadn't been answered because it hadn't been processed yet. Not emotionally, strategically. And that distinction mattered. Emotional reactions arrive quickly and burn out. Strategic ones arrive late and reshape the environment. As the expectation lingered, behavior changed. People stopped speculating publicly. Talking about it felt premature, even risky. When nothing happens for long enough, the smartest move is silence. The city instinctively mirrored the restraint it was observing. That's when attention sharpened. Instead of watching for retaliation, New York started watching for pattern changes, subtle shifts, quiet realignments, signs that the response wouldn't look like punishment, but like correction. The expectation of noise gave way to a deeper concern, that whatever came next would not announce itself at all. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. The city had misread the moment. The laughter wasn't being ignored, it was being stored. And when New York finally understood that, the question stopped being how the response would look. It became where and how many things it would quietly change once it arrived. Silence carries different meanings depending on where it appears. In a courtroom, it's usually procedural. After a public insult, it's deliberate. Days passed without a reaction from Bumpy Johnson. No comment to the press. No visible shift in posture. No effort to reclaim the moment where it happened. To outsiders, the lack of response suggested limitation. The idea that formal space had finally placed boundaries around informal power. Inside Harlem, the interpretation was the opposite. Silence under oath isn't weakness, it's containment. The laughter had happened in a room governed by rules that pretended to suspend everything else. Responding there would have validated that pretense. It would have accepted the courtroom's claim that it was the only arena that mattered. By refusing to react, Bumpy denied the room its victory. That denial mattered. People who understood the pattern knew that responses weren't always meant for the place where the provocation occurred. They were meant for the places where behavior actually changed. Courtrooms produced records. Streets produced memory. And memory was where consequences lasted. The silence also stripped the insult of its intended effect. Laughter aims to provoke. It seeks acknowledgement. Without acknowledgement, it loses momentum. The man who laughed had nothing to respond to, no correction to argue against, no reaction to frame as overreach. The moment remained suspended, unresolved, and increasingly uncomfortable. That discomfort spread. The longer the silence held, the more it began to feel intentional rather than constrained. Observers stopped asking why nothing was happening and started asking what kind of response required this much patience. That question was far more unsettling than any immediate retaliation would have been. Within Harlem, behavior adjusted quietly. People became more cautious about where they stood and how they spoke. Not because of fear, but because they sensed that standards were being recalibrated. When standards change, noise disappears first. The silence also protected the response from being challenged. Anything done too soon could be framed as emotional or excessive. Anything done later, after expectations had collapsed, would feel inevitable. That inevitability was the point. Bumpy's restraint didn't erase the insult. It preserved it. Intact, unarguable, and ready to be used as reference rather than grievance. When disrespect is treated as data instead of offense, it becomes far more powerful. By the time it was clear the silence wasn't going to break, New York had adjusted its posture. People stopped waiting for spectacle. They started watching for shifts they couldn't immediately name. The courtroom had believed it was the end of the story. The silence proved it was only the holding phase. Because when power chooses not to answer in the moment it's challenged, it isn't conceding ground. It's deciding where the lesson will actually land. The change didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived as attention. Not the loud kind that announces itself, but the precise kind that alters behavior without explanation. Conversations involving limits became shorter. Agreements that once relied on assumption began to require confirmation. People who had felt comfortable testing boundaries noticed that the room for error had narrowed. This wasn't coincidence. The laughter in court had planted a question in the city's mind. What happens when public disrespect meets private restraint? The answer wasn't delivered through confrontation. It was delivered through repositioning. The environment around Bumpy Johnson began to tighten, not around him, but around the idea that formal spaces stripped him of influence. That idea quietly collapsed. Meetings took on a different tone. Intermediaries who once spoke casually began choosing words more carefully. The confidence that the courtroom had handled the situation faded. People realized that while the court recorded moments, it didn't resolve meanings, and meanings were what governed behavior afterward. What made the shift effective was its impersonality. No one was singled out. The man who laughed wasn't targeted publicly. Instead, the assumption behind the laughter, the belief that public procedure neutralized private consequence, was removed from circulation. Once that assumption died, behavior adjusted on its own. This is how the city felt the response without seeing it. Harlem understood that the shift wasn't about reclaiming dignity. It was about restoring balance. Public contempt, left unaddressed, could metastasize into precedent. Addressing it directly would have elevated it. The alternative was to change the environment so that repeating it no longer made sense. That's exactly what happened. The places where people once felt emboldened grew quieter. The margins where bravado used to earn approval began to shrink. Not because anyone announced new rules, but because the old shortcuts stopped working. When shortcuts disappear, discipline returns. From the outside, this looked like nothing. From inside the system, it looked like a recalibration. The city started paying attention not to what Bumpy did, but to what stopped happening around him. And that absence carried more meaning than any visible response could have. The shift didn't correct the laugh. It corrected the belief that produced it. And once that belief was corrected, the lesson didn't need reinforcement. The city adjusted because it understood that the courtroom wasn't a boundary, it was a stage. The real consequences would always land elsewhere. That realization marked the beginning of the aftermath. Not loud, not immediate, but unmistakable. New York didn't react all at once, it reoriented. What finally drew the city's attention wasn't an incident, but a pattern. Reporters noticed a change in tone. Law enforcement noticed fewer signals where signals were expected. People who usually filled space with noise began choosing restraint instead. It wasn't fear driving the shift. It was uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads upward. Officials adjusted how they framed risk, not because of a new threat, but because old assumptions no longer held. The idea that the courtroom neutralized informal influence quietly dissolved. The laughter that was supposed to end the matter had done the opposite. It had exposed a blind spot. Rival groups read the same signal. Confidence softened. Testing boundaries felt premature. When a public slight doesn't produce a public response, it forces recalculation. If the response is coming later and elsewhere, the cost of misjudging it rises sharply. At the center of that recalculation was Bumpy Johnson, still refusing to claim the moment or explain it. That refusal mattered more than any visible move. By declining to frame the insult as a personal grievance, he turned it into a citywide question. Where does consequence actually land? New York answered by paying closer attention. People watched not for retaliation, but for alignment. And alignment appeared everywhere. In how meetings were conducted, in how language tightened, in how bravado stopped earning approval. The city didn't need a headline to understand that the meaning of the courtroom moment had shifted. What stunned observers wasn't restraint, it was reach. A single laugh in a formal room had been absorbed, processed, and redistributed as discipline across informal spaces. The correction didn't announce itself, which meant it couldn't be challenged. There was no act to condemn, no overreach to critique. Just a quieter city adjusting to a reality it hadn't anticipated. That's when attention locked in. Not because something dramatic happened, but because the expected drama never arrived. And the environment changed anyway. The city realized that public rooms didn't erase private consequence. They delayed it. And delay, when used deliberately, expands impact. By the time New York fully understood what it was watching, the lesson had already landed. The laughter hadn't humiliated anyone. It had educated the city. And once a city learns where consequence actually lives, it doesn't need reminders. It behaves accordingly. What New York learned in 1955 wasn't about arrogance. It was about misinterpretation. That laugh in the courtroom wasn't dangerous because it was disrespectful. It was dangerous because it assumed the room defined reality. It assumed that procedure erased memory, and that public formality canceled private consequence. It didn't. By refusing to answer the insult where it happened, Bumpy Johnson exposed a deeper truth. Power doesn't vanish in formal spaces. It waits. And when it waits long enough, its response stops being personal and starts being structural. The city expected noise. It received adjustment. No warnings were issued. No lines were drawn in public. But the assumptions behind the laughter disappeared. Behavior changed. Margins tightened. The confidence that once lived in formal immunity gave way to caution. That's why the moment mattered. Not because of who laughed, but because of what the laughter revealed. A belief that consequences only existed where they could be seen. Once that belief collapsed, New York stopped treating certain spaces as safe from accountability. This story isn't about humiliation or revenge. It's about where power actually operates. In 1955, a courtroom offered protection only to those who believed in it. The city learned that respect, once misread, doesn't demand an answer. It creates one, and that answer doesn't arrive with sound. It arrives as behavior, quiet, widespread, permanent.